Story 1. The Phantom Hitchhiker. It was one of those nights when the rain poured as if the heavens had decided to empty their tears. Mark, a delivery driver for a food service company, was used to driving in bad weather, but on this particular night, there was something unsettling in the air. The clock on his dashboard blinked 11:48 p.m. as he navigated a desolate stretch of highway that wound through a series of small, abandoned towns. The rain came down in sheets, turning the road into a mirror that reflected his headlights in 1,000 different directions. His wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear, but every so often, the fog crept in, blurring the line between reality and imagination. Mark turned the corner, and there she was, a young woman standing on the side of the road, soaked to the bone, her thin coat clinging to her like a second skin. Her dark hair stuck to her face, hiding her eyes. She wasn't waving or signaling for help, just standing there, still as a statue. Mark hesitated. It was late, and he didn't often pick up strangers, but something in his gut told him to stop. He slowed the car and rolled down the passenger window just enough to hear her speak over the sound of the rain. "Can I get a ride?" she asked softly, her voice nearly drowned by the storm. He nodded, unlocking the door. She climbed in without a word, shivering in her wet clothes. Mark noticed that despite the warmth inside the car, her teeth chattered. They drove in silence for a while, the sound of the rain hammering against the car, the only noise in the suffocating quiet. Mark tried to make small talk, but she remained mostly silent, answering in brief, cryptic sentences. As they neared the next town, Mark felt an odd chill, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. He glanced at his passenger, and she was staring straight ahead, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her lips were pale, and her eyes, now visible beneath her wet hair, seemed distant and empty. He decided to ask where she needed to go. When he turned to speak, she was gone. Mark slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. The passenger seat was empty, still soaked with rainwater. He looked behind him, but the road was deserted. There was no sign of her anywhere. His heart raced as he recalled every detail, his mind struggling to understand what had just happened. A few days later, he learned the chilling truth. A woman matching her description had died in a car accident on that same stretch of road exactly 10 years ago. Locals spoke of her ghost appearing to drivers on rainy nights, always disappearing without a trace. Story 2. The Man in the Trench Coat. Cindy had always loved driving at night. It was her time to relax and gather her thoughts, especially after long, stressful days. But on this particular night, the rain made the drive feel eerie and unnerving. It was as if the darkness had swallowed the road, leaving her to navigate through an endless, wet void. She was heading home after visiting a friend in a neighboring town, taking the back roads to avoid the heavy traffic on the highway. The rain tapped a rhythmic beat on the roof of her car as she kept her focus on the narrow, winding road. The occasional flash of lightning illuminated the surrounding trees, casting long, twisted shadows that flickered out of existence as quickly as they appeared. As she rounded a bend, her headlights caught the figure of a man standing on the side of the road. He was wearing a long, dark trench coat, his hat pulled low over his face. He wasn't hitchhiking or moving, just standing in the rain as if he were waiting for someone. Cindy's gut tightened, but she kept driving. Something about the man felt off, his posture too still, too unnatural. She tried to convince herself that he was probably just someone whose car had broken down, but there was no vehicle in sight. A few miles later, the road straightened, and she relaxed a little. The man was behind her now, just a strange figure lost in the night. But as the rain intensified, Cindy's sense of calm evaporated when she saw him again. The same man, standing on the side of the road, motionless, his face hidden under the brim of his hat. Her heart began to race. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of her unless he had been running at inhuman speed. She pressed down on the accelerator, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. She sped down the road, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was just her imagination, or maybe it was some prank, but she didn't dare slow down to find out. Another few miles passed, and she saw him again. This time, he was in the middle of the road, standing directly in front of her. She screamed and swerved, barely missing him as her tires slid on the wet pavement. Her car spun out of control, crashing into a ditch. Shaking and terrified, Cindy managed to pull herself out of the car. She scanned the road, but the man was gone, vanished as if he had never been there. Stranded in the rain, she flagged down a passing vehicle for help. Later, she discovered that several drivers had reported seeing the same man in a trench coat on rainy nights along that road. None of them had ever been able to explain how he appeared and disappeared so quickly. Some said he was the spirit of a man who had been killed in a hit-and-run years ago. Others believed he was something far worse, something that wasn't human at all. Story 3. The Distant Light. Jacob and his girlfriend Sarah were on a road trip, driving through rural back roads to escape the monotony of the interstate. The rain had started earlier that afternoon, turning into a downpour by the time night fell. They were in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, and the GPS had already led them astray once. "We should have taken the highway," Sarah muttered, glancing nervously out the window. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 cars, and the rain made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Jacob was about to agree when a faint light appeared in the distance, flickering through the sheets of rain. It was odd, too high off the ground to be headlights, and too steady to be lightning. It hovered in the distance, almost like a lantern swinging in the wind. "What's that?" Sarah asked, leaning forward to get a better look. Jacob squinted. "I don't know. Maybe someone's house?" But as they drove closer, the light didn't get any clearer. It remained a distant, floating glow, always just out of reach no matter how far they drove. After a few more miles, Sarah started to panic. "Turn around, Jacob. This doesn't feel right." Jacob felt the same unease, but there was nowhere to turn. The narrow road was flanked by dense woods, the rain relentless. The light continued to bob and flicker, taunting them, leading them deeper into the unknown. Then, without warning, the car's engine sputtered and died. The lights flickered off, plunging them into darkness. Jacob tried the ignition, but the car refused to start. They sat in stunned silence, the only sound the rain hammering against the roof. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "What now?" Before Jacob could respond, the light reappeared, this time much closer. It floated just beyond the hood of the car, illuminating the trees around them. It wasn't a lantern. It was a pale, ghostly orb, glowing faintly in the rain. Suddenly, the air inside the car grew cold, and both Jacob and Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something terrible was watching them from the shadows. The light hovered for a moment longer, before flickering out, leaving them alone in the darkness once again. It took hours for a tow truck to find them, and when they told the driver about the light, he shook his head grimly. "You're not the first to see it," he said. "They say the light leads people off the road. Sometimes they don't come back." As they drove away, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that whatever the light was, it had been trying to lure them somewhere they should never go, and the next time it appeared, someone might not be so lucky. These rainy night drives remind us that there's more to fear on the road than just bad weather. Some things, phantom hitchhikers, mysterious figures, and ghostly lights, lurk in the shadows, waiting for the next unwary traveler to cross their path.